Hello and welcome to my next NAP. NAP stands for Nonprofit Auditor Points, and I'm your nonprofit auditor. My name is Irina Ryzhkova, and I'm happy to discuss some of the accounting and auditing concepts and explain them to nonprofit organizations. Hopefully, you will find them useful. Today, I want to talk about statement of functional expenses and the most common mistakes and misunderstanding that we see among our clients and see in their financial statements. Statement of functional expenses, one of the main financial statements that you see in the auditor's report, and you also see that in the Form 990. That statement is very highly used by everybody, by the board members, by management, by the funders, by users of financial statements to understand efficiency and effectiveness of nonprofits. And allocation of expenses by function is very critical because it gives a lot of information to individuals who look at your financial statements. Therefore, it's important to understand what your nonprofit communicates through statement of functional expenses and how it needs to be presented correctly. So let me go over some of the main mistakes that nonprofits do in their statement of functional expenses. Number one mistake that we see is that nonprofits take their total expenses and apply them equally percentage-wise. So, for example, you take all your chart of accounts, all the expenses, and you're just saying, okay, we're gonna take every account, 90% gonna go to program, 10% gonna go to admin and management, and 10% gonna go to fundraising. And they allocate all the expenses this way. That's very obviously incorrect and provides no information to the reader of financial statements. The only information that we can derive from that statement that organization really did not perform any allocation and there is no useful information provided in statement of functional expenses this way because that statement is not correct. Number two main mistake that we see, that nonprofits do develop some percentage allocation. And we just say, for example, we apply to this group of expenses, let's just say our office, we use 50% for program and 50% for fundraising, and we would apply it 50-50. And then you would allocate office expenses, rent expenses 50-50, but then your utility, your phone will be applied differently. So if you develop a system of allocation, make sure that you group them accordingly. For example, another mistake we see, if you apply payroll expenses, salary and wages, you properly allocate percentage-wise based on the number of time that people spent in each function. But then your payroll expenses, you put everything in the program. Payroll tax expenses, you put everything in the program. And benefits, you put everything in the program. How is that possible? Your payroll wages probably should be allocated similarly to payroll tax and payroll benefits that you pay to employees. Therefore, if you develop methodology for specific group of expenses, make sure that this methodology applies to every item in your group. We also, that's second mistake. The third mistake, statement of functional expenses apply expenses between three functions. First function, program, second function, management in general, and the third function is fundraising. And these are functions. What it means, the nonprofit have to take your regular natural types of expenses and allocate them by function. Name of the function cannot be the same as the name of natural type of expense. So if your function is administrative expenses, your natural type of expenses cannot be administrative. because it defeats the purpose. So on the left side of expenses, it has to be natural type of expenses. A natural type would be travel, supplies, meals, mailing expenses, taxes, and so forth. They cannot be lump sum as overhead expense. Overhead expense, it's not natural type of expense. Miscellaneous expenses, it's not good definition of expense, especially if the amounts are material. Also, your statement for functional expense should not be overwhelming, and by type of expense you would typically have 10, 15, maybe not more than 20 natural type of expenses, but they have to be logically grouped together. So if you have expense that just say fundraising expense, it's not a natural type of expense, because fundraising expenses can include rent of facility, they can include meals, they can include some supplies, they can include some gifts that were purchased for special events, maybe some entertainment expenses, and so forth. So when you have a natural type of fundraising expenses, that's incorrect, because fundraising expenses, it's a function. To summarize, your natural type of expenses needs to be split by a natural type and not by function, because function is on top, natural type of expenses on the left. So another common mistake that we see in the statement of functional expenses, when nonprofits, very busy with allocating, start presenting negative amounts. So if your total supplies $10,000 and you allocate $8,000 to program and $3,000 to fundraising, you cannot have a negative $1,000 for fundraising to make it balance to $10,000. Therefore, please be careful when you're allocating your expenses by function. There should not be any negative amounts inside allocations. Negative amounts do not make sense. It's like you're saying we spent for general and administrative expenses negative $1,000. Does not make sense. It's incorrect on its face. Another mistakes we see very often on statement of functional expenses, when nonprofits believe the higher percentage we allocate towards program, it's better. And definitely a lot of rating agencies prefer to see at least 70 or 75% goes directly to the program. It's also does not benefit a nonprofit to show that you have 90% in program, that you pretty much spent no money on the admin and fundraising. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it might actually give disservice to nonprofit, because no nonprofit can operate without any overhead expenses. Even if everybody done by volunteers, that most likely some volunteer time also needs to be recognized as in kind. So what do I mean by that? When you report 90% or higher goes directly to program, you indicating two things. Maybe we're not correctly allocating and we actually eating our admin and we just presenting it as a program, or we're completely suffocating our nonprofit and we're not investing at all in the infrastructure, in building the support system for nonprofit. And it's also scary and dangerous practice, because eventually nonprofit will run out of the resources to support the operation activity. And you're saying we absolutely have no room to grow because we're really running nonprofit on our the most efficient potential scale. Just think about it, and maybe it's not very healthy to report such a good high percentage towards the program activity. And the last mistake that I want to point, sometimes nonprofits take very obvious not program expenses and report them as programs. For example, if nonprofit has to pay for licenses to operate, it's not a program activity. You cannot apply anything to program, even though this license is necessary to run a program. All work that nonprofit do, it's necessary to run a program, but it's not a direct program activity. Direct program expenses spent directly to run the program, not the supporting, not the spend in admin and management and fundraising. So license application would not be direct program activity. And other expenses that nonprofit pays, unless if it's not direct program expense, it should not be allocated to a program. And lastly, if nonprofit has the system of allocation, which every nonprofit should have, make sure that the system is reviewed, updated, and methodology of allocation of expenses is documented and understood by everybody inside the organization, specifically by accounting firm, by management, and by the board, and utilized, understood, and updated at least annually. Thank you so much. And this was a summary of main mistakes that nonprofit do in allocation of statement of functional expenses. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to see you for my next step. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.